It's like the creative process. Scientists have a hypothesis. They design an experiment to either prove that hypothesis or disprove that hypothesis. They look at the results of that experiment, and they may change their hypothesis. What a lot of times happens is the results confound the scientist, and then they change their hypothesis, or they engage in a new area of study. And I think that's what happens with drawing Obsoleta, is that basically the experiment becomes a separate thing than your imagination. And in drawing Obsoleta, the snake is a separate thing than my drawing. It's alive. It's alive. It's not alive. It's an alive being. And the tension between me trying to manipulate the snake and its own will creates a piece of art that I can never imagine. I can never imagine these movements, and I can never draw them in charcoal. So I'm free to let the process be more interesting than my ideas of what the process are about. And I think that's where science is so interesting. Scientists are so detached generally so detached from their results that they can look at their results objectively, and they're free to let the experiments and the results determine what the study is. And I think that's how artists and scientists work in common. I measure my results on emotional impact or beauty or conceptual force. And scientists have other rubrics that they measure their studies on. But this was an experiment that I set up that I think is more successful than me trying to draw the snake into the rolling hills of the Piedmont. It's really about the creative process and about how that is a wild thing, and art is a wild thing. Artists are smaller than the art they create. And I guess that's the thing I learned about drawing Obsoleta. And we can talk about it a little bit more later, but let's get into the lecture part of it. So that might be all you hear about that, but let's see. It is right. Let's stop this. Let's use my tech stuff. X that out and go into here. Boom. Away. Let's go. Okay. Like I said, I studied zoology in school, and I'm very much a scientific mind. When I look at a human, I see an animal. And when I look at a landscape, I see an ecological system. So for me, this is a territorial mark. My role as an artist is to look at animal instincts seeping out in our modern lives and making them visible and evident. So these markings in caves is a good example. Now, this is not where I started. This is where I am now. I started in documentary social realist photography. I graduated from Duke and spent a couple of years traveling with migrant farm workers, photographing kind of their lives, their incredibly interesting lives and the plight of migrant farm workers as they travel the East Coast from tobacco in North Carolina down to oranges in Florida. And actually I went home to Mexico with this family, Eduardo, Arturo, and James. Much like my hero, Dorothy Lane, who's I think one of the greatest artists, one of the greatest American artists. And you can see how much Dorothy Lane influenced me. And one thing to keep in mind with Dorothy Lane is she is the greatest gestural artist I think that we've had. She's like the Rodin of gesture. Look at the gesture of the hand to the mouth and the kid's gesture. This is let's see if I have that picture. No, I skipped it. Anyway, you can see that heroic core and the kind of the gestural the attention to gesture was very, I was very aping Dorothea Lange. I read this book doing this when I was involved with the farm workers by Susan Sontag called On Photography. And it was a kind of a postmodern photography book about what does photography really do and what do photographers really do when they photograph social ills. Do they really examine social ills? Do they find social ills and show them to the world and something gets done about it? Yes, that happens quite a bit. Photography is a great tool for that. Dorothea Lange was a great person who did that, and like Jacob Riis actually changed child labor laws through photography. But if they're not doing that, then what are they doing? And I had to make a decision at some point in my career. Was I actually helping migrant farm workers in the Orozco family with my photography? If I was, what should I be taking photographs of? The terrible living conditions they lived in, how their family gets split apart depending on what crop needs to be taken, how half the family is illegal and half the family is legal, and there's this whole thing about who can cross the border and not. There's a lot of people who cross the border to have, in the Roscoe's, Eduardo here, his mother crossed the border to have Eduardo in the U.S. But then when he moved back to Mexico as a young kid, he couldn't go to school because it was U.S. So there's all this weird border stuff that we all know about. And was I photographing that? No, I wasn't. I really wasn't. I was photographing something different. And I was photographing something that was much more lyrical, much more romantic, and much more about how humans and the landscape had this tension and this, they had a beautiful tension together. And after a long time of paralysis around photography, and this picture was kind of an opening, I kind of changed my focus. This picture happened, this was a kind of a made-up picture. I put my camera away for a month in the summer, and I just worked with the migrant workers. I just worked all day, picked tobacco all day with them, picked cucumbers all day, sweet potatoes. Whatever they did, I did. And I was writing at the same time, and I thought the camera was like, I was reading Susan Sontag, and I was feeling guilty about photographing them, and I was having this real paralysis about the whole thing. Why was this like pretty privileged white dude who went to Duke, hanging out with this Mexican family, and those questions were coming into my mind. I don't think, they were probably thinking the same thing, but it didn't paralyze them. And then, as I was kicking with Eduardo, I saw him like, this is called bottom prime. And the way you pick broadleaf tobacco, you pick the lower leaves first, and through the season, you pick the top leaves. And the bottom leaves are the worst, because they're all dirty, you're kneeling down low, it's really hot. The tobacco is a very hot plant, so it's hotter than the air. It's like 100 degrees. You get green tobacco sickness. It's about the worst crop to pick. And so I was watching Eduardo going by the road and getting swallowed up in the tobacco. And I told him, I said, next time you go by, stay still for a second. I want to take a picture of you slipping up under the leaves. And he was like, okay, whatever. And so I took that picture, and that picture kind of broke something. There is the facelessness of migrant work, but there's also this, how the plaid of his shirt contrasts with the natural organic form of the leaves, how they become, he's diving into the earth. And that, to me, was kind of more powerful personally than the real issue. I guess I had to come to the terms, was I an artist or was I a social documentarian? If I was a social documentarian, this is not the picture I should take. It's a little romantic. If I was an artist, then I should not feel like I was doing some great deed for humanity by going out and practicing my art. You know, maybe it was just a selfish endeavor, and I just wanted to express something that wasn't about social realism. And so I took this picture, and then I took this picture. This is Doc Fraser in Cornfield. You can see Doc, I'm pointing up here. I'll miss the there. And I realized I was kind of into the human form and the animal form and the plant form colliding in this very tense and strange and beautiful frame of photography. This is right next to where I live. This is our next door neighbors in a hog killing when I was living in Eastern Kentucky. Then I started examining Eastern Kentucky around kind of formal relationships, how people lived. You know, Eastern Kentucky is a vast expanse of land, but people live relatively close together. And so the stereotype of Eastern Kentucky, which is probably not different than the stereotype of the Ozarks, is oh, people are really clannish. You know, all the families live together. Oh, it's incestual. Oh, you can't go up there because that's this one family. Well, it's not really true, but in some cases, in some part, there is a kernel of truth to that, and that people heir their land to their kids, and there's not really a lot of good land to build a house on. And what everyone wants is a little piece of stream. So the land gets divided into these really thin slivers, and they all cluster up together. And it is family land. And it's not the kind of weird incestual clannish thing, it's just that generations want a piece of the stream. And it looks like, if you look at a property map in Eastern Kentucky, and the mountains are much more steeper and higher than the Ozarks, it looks like the forms of a china cup, the cracks in an old china cup. And like these little slivers everywhere. It's so kind of impossible to figure out who owns what. And this was the holler right over the hill from where I live. And this was a case where the landscape formed the culture. Like, we are living at the will of these mountains. We're not, our culture is formed around the landscape. Of course, and you can see the isolation of the Eastern Kentucky hills. And you can see this door. I'll love this little lad walking back to his trailer. It's something beautiful and scary, and maybe even gothic about, you know, the landscape and how people live. Of course, the real issue in Eastern Kentucky is strip mining and energy production through coal and mountaintop removal. So as this mountain, this is Carcassonne Mountain, it was gone about 6 months later after I took this picture. It's actually, and it's probably running this projector right now, so you know, maybe I'm kind of guilty of strip mining this mountain, but I think you get a lot of coal from Wyoming out here. But anyway, same difference. When the mountain gets moved away, how does that change the culture? That was a real interest of mine, and I started looking back into my own past about that. My sexton side of my past, I have to say that. Joy, she's my first cousin from the Whetstone side, coming from Little Croc. Shout out to you. Anyway, my mother's family grew up in Fish Springs, Tennessee. It was the first settlement in Tennessee. And in 1942, the TVA, during the FDR administration, in works progress, flooded the valley. And it happens all over the country. And moved everyone out. And I did a series about how I mined all those pictures. This is a distant relative of mine, right before he moved, as the waters were coming out, and I recreated that land with all the TVA maps and all the TVA, great photography from TVA, and looked at how our family kind of changed. And that's when I really got into landscape. After that project, I went to graduate school at Yale. And One thing great about going to Yale, there's a lot of great things about going to Yale. One thing is they have this thing called the Beinecke Library. The Beinecke Library is one of the great collections of rare artifacts in the world. And one of the artifacts, some of the artifacts is Timothy O'Sullivan photographs. In 1870, when photography was it was a toddler. It was invented in 1840, but it really didn't get going until about 1850, and it was a toddler. And the United States was also kind of a toddler. You know, we hadn't really grown up yet. We knew that there was a West, and we were fighting a bunch of wars and paying a bunch of money to buy it, but we didn't know really what it looked like. We thought it might look like this Bierstadt painting, and of course the Crystal Bridges House in Bierstadt. You know, who wouldn't fight a war over that? I mean, it's beautiful. It's cathedral-like. It's heavenly. You know, deer are plenty of food to eat. Ducks. That's beautiful. So but we didn't have any idea, the Eastern senators, what the West really looked like. So they took this infantile technology of truth. You know, photography. Oh, it's not a painting. It records the real truth. And they sent photographers along with the U.S. Geological Survey in 1870 to travel the 40th parallel. What are we doing all this for? And this is what they got back. This is Timothy O'Sullivan. This is also what they got back. This is William Henry Jackson. This is Mountain of the Holy Cross. Now, this is actually a real landmark, but the snow never really gets like that. So he had to Photoshop in the right arm of the cross. Actually, he painted it on the negative, right? And when, of course, this was given to the senators, and they were like, yes, well, this is a sign from God. Because photography doesn't lie, and this is a cross, and we're doing the right thing. Yet it doesn't really jive with O'Sullivan's pictures. Now, who's telling the truth here? Now, O'Sullivan was a photographer during the Civil War. He was Matthew Brady's assistant. So he had seen the carnage, the worst carnage you've ever thought about. I mean, there's no war like the Civil War where people were dying of, like, rot on the battleground because they get shot with a piece of lead right here. You know, in World War I, they figured out how to save that guy. In the Civil War, they were just kind of like, you're gone. You're just going to die of gangrene right there. And so Timothy O'Sullivan was seeing that stuff. My theory is he had post-traumatic stress disorder. No, I think, well, and I'm kind of serious about that actually. I think he's like the death metal of 19th century. His photographs are like, all of them are just heavy and foreboding and ugly and, you know, they're just tough. And there's another photographer. There was 3 or 4 photographers. This is
you can look at your notes.
It'll come to me. This is another person, photographer, traveling that 40th parallel. And the art of perception is, anyway, it'll come to me in the middle of my lecture. Notice how kind of graceful and poetic these pictures are. The human folly is kind of falling off the landscape, but in the back there's this beautiful line of mountains. He's always into like the folly of human advancement, the sunken ship, the city that's not really going to survive. And he's kind of like, I would say like the Wilco, you know, the art rock of 18th century photography. What this goes down to say is like, there's no truth in photography. There's an artist behind the camera, whether it's William Henry Jackson, you know, or kind of a religious figure who has an agenda, Timothy O'Sullivan, who also has an agenda, or
Carlton Watkins.
Carlton Watkins, thank you, Carlton Watkins, who also has an agenda, right? Maybe not an agenda, but a way of seeing. And so, I guess, I kind of took that from Yale and started doing my own landscape work. And what was my way of seeing the Appalachian Mountains? And with this blend of cultural and natural, where you don't know what's cultural and natural. I've told a lot of people this before, but okay, here's my biological mind at work. It's early spring. I use a giant 8x10 camera. I'm like this nerd in the landscape, hearing all this equipment, and you know, I'm trudging through these things, and I come upon this scene, and the hackles in the back of my neck stand up. I'm like, all of a sudden, having a fear response. My biological mind is like, oh, I'm having a fear response. That's curious. Why am I having a fear response? I was like, well, I'm obviously somewhere I shouldn't be. Why am I somewhere I shouldn't be? Well, there's litter in an old chair. It looks like it's just been left. And then I started thinking, well, that's interesting. Some redneck dude has been fishing here. And he left his 40-ounce bottle of beer and his pack of cigarettes and his worm bucket. And he just left. And I'm having a fear response. It's a lot like a dog peeing on a stump. It's a visual marker. It's a territorial marker. Now, was he aware that that's a territorial marker? Probably not. But who knows? But it certainly had the effect of being a territorial marker by stating very clearly, you know, liberal environmental guy who has a notion of what nature is, you are not in a protected state park now. You're at my fishing hole, and I'm around. And so, it's a beautiful place, but it's also an ugly place, and it's fraught with tension of the human animal, the most scary animal, and the most beautiful animal, and the most complicated animal in the landscape. So I kind of appreciate the litter as almost, I don't like it, of course. Sometimes I pick stuff like that up, but also appreciate it as there is something going on that's beyond just an ignorant dude littering. It's also a signal of where territories are. And I think that's always brewing. I think our animal instincts are always brewing. And so, these are some of kind of my animal men, I guess. Watchers. Just so you know, camouflage has a slimming effect.
Clearly.
But I think it's funny, and I love contemporary camouflage. It's mossy oak or real tree camouflage. It's like, they are actual pictures of the landscape, digitally rendered, made into cloth, and then when you wrap them on your body, the landscape is usually something that's beautiful. But when you wrap it on your body, it becomes something that's lethal. And so the very fine line between beauty and death, you know, between beauty and lethality, I love camouflage. So I started making camouflage. I made this camouflage. This camouflage is actually, this print is actually pretty cute. It's actually still connected to the plant that I made it from. So he's actually is the plant. Brad there is. This is a different type of camouflage. This is me on an August night in eastern North Carolina when it's probably about 90 degrees outside. I took this picture. I just wanted a picture of catfish, but I realized like I was so sweaty and the catfish was so wet, we kind of became part of the same thing. Now, every time I kind of embark on a project, and if I get halfway through, I always go back into history. This is Martin Coppinger print from 1480. And it came, I found it in a book called Landscape and Memory by Simon Schaumann. And the quote is about this is like, in the middle of the 15th century, or in the beginning of the 15th century, that the natural man and the man of the woods was seen as the antithesis of the virtuous Christian citizen. You know, it was like this sexual, they were depicted as the sexually omnivorous wild man. Then it switched in the middle, just 50 years later, in the middle of the 15th century, the wild man became the most kind of virtuous protector of all the values of the culture. And so I think we're in that all the time. We're in that switch between like the natural man and the wild man. And this weird sense of masculinity in the woods can be both beautiful and natural, and can be also both scary and kind of immoral. And so I actually have a man in my life who is like that. My Uncle Tim, he is a real wild man. He was never really had a job, always lived in the woods off like deer meat and potatoes, and drug addict, and never provided anything except for maybe himself and one of his girlfriends that he had all the time. And so he was always someone I kind of admired and feared. And my parents would always like make me feel wary of him, but they also kind of loved him in a way. And one day he told me, he used to catch sucker fish out of the stream and eat them. And they're these little bottom feeder fish, kind of like catfish, but they're little tiny minnows. You use them for bait, but he would eat them. And I said, I gotta take a picture of you catching the suckerfish. And he said, well, Jeff, when the first dogwood petal hits the ground, that's when they'll start running. And I thought, immediately thought, wow, that's like some kind of ancient wisdom that's un-Googlable, searchable, that no clock ever knows. He is in tune with some kind of natural clock. Even though he's not fit for modern society, he's fit for some other thing that is deep and profound. So he's always working around in my kind of tension between beauty and horror, I guess. I also tend to take masculinity and try to turn it around. This is my ode to Lask, so I have a series of hunters in repose. And they're like this homoerotic sense of these masculine men, and the way I we both kind of get off on doing this because I'm like, hey, I should lay down. It's like, really? I'm working really close. I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, so much. I recognize my work is so overly romantic sometimes that I'm like, okay, well, I'll just put it on, and I'll put more romance than you can take. And so this picture was kind of the first of it. These guys were my guides, and I was photographing a landscape on this abandoned strip mine. I had this camera that you had to get up under the cloth, and so I had my back to him, and I was tinkering around with the camera, and I finally took the picture. And I turned around and was about to say, I'm ready to go, but what came out of my mouth was, don't move a muscle. Stay right there. I gotta take this picture. And so I swiveled my camera around, got up under the dark on my cloth, started tinkering around with all the knobs and stuff. And this guy over here said, you want me to go over there and hug up on him? And right then I realized, like, while the whole world is like postmodern. They know exactly how they're being signified, how they're being represented. They know the joke before I've told it, but they're indicating to me, we know what you're doing. It's cool, whatever. It's kind of funny. We get it, and so it's very. I kind of love getting in those situations. But anyway, I want to talk about a work that was made in the 16th century by Peter Bruegel at Elder. And I guess to talk about photography in a way. This is masterpiece work. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And what it does, it encompasses a whole society in one picture. So basically, we learn everything. This is how you cut wheat. It's the women's job to bundle it looks like. They grow apple trees in the wheat fields for some reason, we don't know. They bundle it, they make their bread out of it, they make their beer out of it. This guy's a drum. He's got a little codpiece, which I think is kind of funny. I also carry, these two little birds indicate, look over here, because they're carrying this wheat to that wagon. That wagon goes down that road to that ship. That ship swells out of the harbor, and they come back with money to build churches and schools. The kids can have a little leisure. They have a windmill up there that pumps the water. So what you see in this picture is like how a culture works. And the interesting thing about it is how it's narrated. It's narrated from about, not like God would see, not like down all these little tiny people in this big world, or not like man would see, like face to face. It's kind of between God and man. It's an omniscient narrator. He narrates everything perfectly, right? In this picture too, I won't go into what all the cultural stuff of that, but a narrator who's omniscient sees everything and has to describe everything. Like even this scraggly weed, which you would think, why would you take so much time painting that? Well, omniscient narrators have to be omniscient. You can't not describe something. So I took the same type, it's very photographic, I took the same type of stance and elevating the camera and trying to see a broad perspective of my world in Kentucky and Tennessee. Any given Sunday. Intimate moments. This is a pro-am bass tournament. And so, just to give you a little, when this series was going on, I work with this giant camera, so basically I'm a performer. What you don't see is I'm on the top of this building. I have talked to Preacher Reeves and all these different people about what I'm doing. And so what he's saying in the microphone is, there's this fellow up here on the roof is going to take everybody's picture with his old-timey camera, and you have to be still for 1 second. All right? And everybody goes, okay. And he goes, okay, 1, 2, 3. Take the picture, and then he goes into, are you done? I'm like, I'm done. It's like, okay, back to the tournament. We got 14 pounds and 5 ounces of largemouth bass by junior, whoever. And so it's like, what you don't see is like, I'm performing. Everyone sees me, and I'm trying to kind of get the crowd involved. In this picture, I can't do that. I'm trying to figure out what the best composition is with a dynamic system. Everyone's walking around. So I know everyone has to be still. And I know if this man and his boys walk out of the frame, the picture's dead. That leads you into everything else. If they put their hands down, they're about to touch. These pictures are kind of large. The picture's gone. So it's this really kind of omniscient view that I have to kind of acquire. And this is a picture by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in the 30s. After I finished that project, I kind of wanted to get out of a 19th century look. my pictures were all about this kind of opening up of space. And so now we'll kind of fast forward, and I look at the work of historical artists a lot. So I look at how Laszlo Moholy-Nagy advanced. So I mean, this is a pretty graphic, interesting picture. 2 years later, he takes this picture, which is hard to figure out. But then you get it, right? There's these graphical elements, but he's on the top of something like that. And then 2 years later, he takes this picture, which is totally abstract. He's taking photography from a realist medium and taking it into an abstract. Frederick Sommer, the same thing. These are landscapes without skies, so they look like these abstract textures. And then he actually goes into making abstract textures of cut paper and books on angle. And so this is when I start trying to like marry my kind of culture nature thing to much more of an abstract space where you don't know if what's in front of what. This is, I call this one unused routine. It's a building that never got built. That's actually older than the trees. Which is kind of what I think about nature. I think that we determine that there's a nature. There was no nature before humans because it was just it. You know, we said this is nature and this is not nature. And so actually culture is older than nature, and this is something I kind of toy with a lot. I find if you collapse space in pictures, you can crash the hard drive of the viewer. Like, I'm comparing this little part to this and this to this, and there's a spatial thing happens where it gets confusing. And once that you get formally confusing, abstract art, you figure out, well, what does this mean? And if I have a viewer saying, what is it and what does it mean, then I've opened the door to where they can interpret the picture. All of these kind of come into what I'm doing now. And what I'm doing now is a bunch of different, I guess, interactions with landscape. These are made with an electron microscope. At UNC, they asked me the science department gave me a pass on electron microscope and said, we want you to make art with this $7 million tool. Don't break it. I'm like, I probably will break it, but I'll do it. And so I started making these landscapes. I noticed that these landscapes are just, basically I would go to Whole Foods or you know, the Harris Theater and buy little bits of food to eat and to look at in the electron microscope. And so what I noticed was that electron microscopes don't work on light. They work with electron beams. And those electron beams have radiation. And if you shower the sample with electron beams, they actually dematerialize. You break down the molecular structure. They go away. They ablate. And I made a video about, well, I told one of the people who run the electron microscope, I'm like, my samples are getting cooked. They're going away. He said, well, you've got to coat them in a heavy metal, and we can do all that. And I was like, but I like it. Is there any way I could do it? And we're like, well, no, people don't. That's a bad thing to do in an electron microscope. Then I realized, well, I can make a video of it and show what it really looks like. So I'm going to play a little bit of this. So I took the food that I ate and hunks of my skin. I would like take little chunks out of my hand and my fingerprints. And the more I looked at it, the more it would go away. It's kind of like photography in a way. The more you photograph something, you kind of just, in some weird way, you destroy it, you know. So, we'll just oops. And so a lot of these have to not a scientific perspective, which is down, analyzing something, but a perspective that is out, the poetics of space. Even though I am actually looking down through this sensor, I figured out how to make the tool seem like I'm looking out across space. So it's not this part right here. This is, as I back up and change perspectives, you'll see. This is me just kind of melting a piece of, I think that's it's hard to tell what it is. I think that was a tiny 10,000x piece of corn. So this is a kind of a landscape. Where, you can see kind of a landscape topology. And this is when I start basically destroying the sample. When I zoom back, you can see exactly exactly the frame that I was looking at, which is, I thought was really curious. Like, you can see the mark I made from where I was looking. I don't really know what that means, but it's uncanny how that square was imprinted. So, I guess this is me breaking into a different way to look at photography, landscape, and kind of nature and culture and where we are now. It might even have something deeper to do with mortality. As I get old, I have sickness in my family, so I'm kind of watching things fall apart. And so this is kind of a dark piece where I'm kind of making things fall apart in a way. I don't know if it's that deep, honestly. I just kind of make what I make. So we'll go on that. Stop it. And let's go into this. There's another landscape. Oh wait, that's not there, that's here. This is another landscape piece I made. It's called the Albemarle Sound. And the Albemarle Sound is a landscape feature in North Carolina. It's the large bay between the Outer Banks, this very thin strip of islands, and the mainland. And it's a big hunting ground. It's a duck hunting paradise. People go from all over the world to go there. And there's these little tiny islands that have these loblolly pines that grow on them. That you can see the foreground of this glassy sound and the background of more water, even the ocean. So if you've ever been to the Outer Banks, this might kind of look familiar to you. Let's just play it. It's I don't even know if to call it a video, but it's something about landscape, culture, nature,
Oh, yeah. Hell yes. Yeah, shoot me again. Dead bird! Dead bird! Dead bird! That's a blue beam. Dead bird! Dead bird!
So in this piece, it's a waveform. This is a sound waveform. This is the way a sound looks on a computer screen. And I was making this long video piece about Duck Dynasty or whatever. I just wanted to film duck hunters and make some piece out of it. And when I started editing the sound, I saw this and thought, wow, it looks exactly like the landscape I was just in. And then that kind of settled in. I was like, so the sound is a map of the landscape. It's also a map of the narrative. You can see Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, climax, denouement. It's like the classic, it's a map of a narrative, it's a map of the landscape, and it's all done in sound. And so it's one of those things where I just completely threw all the footage away. I never touched it again, and I just used this as as a way to map and express something about the landscape. That, and we'll go through this real quick. We'll go through these other ones. No, not there. Another way, probably one of the most intense projects I've ever done is this cave project. I photographed the interiors of saltpeter caves in Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia for a couple of years. And these caves are natural formations, but they're also cultural formations. The saltpeter is a type of soil that is made from 1 million years of bat urine. Bats go and winter in the same place, and they pee in the same place. The soil becomes rich with nitrates. If you mine that soil and distill it, it becomes gunpowder. It's explosive. So that's what the South used, where they mined gunpowder for the Civil War. So a lot of the caves have been culturally modified to get a mule in, or to get a person in. And they've also been modified in that they became these sites of lore and fascination, where people would just write all over the cave. So this is 200 years of graffiti in what I call art in caves. For instance, let's go ahead really quickly. This right here, these are tally marks from how many bags of saltpeter was taken out of the cave, probably in 1865, right around the end of the war. This is a 1913 signature that's dated star from myspace.com, which is 2005. It was already defunct, so its history was collapsed in a few years. So there's 200 years of history here. And then there's this, which is a color theory. I can only think of like Joseph Albert's color theory. You would probably love that. But it's done by teenagers. It's the kind of like vernacular art and the layered art that I think is so expressive and says so much about our culture. Again, I'm not only in a landscape with no horizon, no ground, no space, but I'm also confusing space. Like what's in front, what's behind. It's very confusing to be in a cave. I'm also comparing this work to the caves of Lascaux, France, and Alton, Spain. And what they were interested in is frank representations of animals.
Attention, museum guests. Crystal Bridges is now closed.
And what we're interested in is expressive gestures of identity.
Thank you.
Right? We're interested in saying that we were here. Now they were too. This is a signature of sorts, made in 30,000 years ago. And these are too. These are like hands where you chew up a piece of charcoal, blow it out of your hands and do this, right? And you can easily see how these signatures become text, become letters, so become these signatures. This is again Glasgow, France, and near the border of Huntsville, Alabama. So in 50,000 years, maybe these are the Lascaux. These are the Lascaux caves. These will be studied because this stuff isn't going to go away. I'm also interested in like comparing these caves to contemporary art, like the art of Cy Twombly, right? This primitive scrawl that he examined that became his paintings, or the art of Jean-Michel Basquiat, this kind of graffiti-esque, layered, textured piece that has historical figures and parts of historical references that we understand. And also the caves are just kind of beautiful, the entropy between rock and water, actually incredibly beautiful, or disturbing, or bodily. It's inside the body of the rock. So comparing it to works like Louis Bourgeois, who did the same kind of thing in rock, or the extruded work of Lee Bonteque. So the cave for me is like reaching forward into the past and into the present. And I guess a lot like the Bruegel picture, I think these caves really reference history. This is a painting by Anselm Kiefer. It's called Nero Paints, and it's about the folly of war, the folly of art, and how everything, all these fields that were so well cared for, are burned down with the invasion of armies, houses set on fire, and it's somewhere somebody's painting it. It seems like kind of ridiculous, but it also sets a moment in time, right? That making things a matter sets it in time for us to reflect on later. I think that's what a lot of Kiefer's work about. And I think the same about these caves. It sets, the paintings in these caves set a moment in time. A span of 200 years of moments, from civil war deserters, from scientists who make marks in these caves, from teenage lovers, from kind of people escaping and commemorating their existence in this very, very private place. In a way, the caves for me represent a real, like, both a struggle and a tension with and a coming together of like man and nature. They're so much a part of our past that we keep returning to them out of some like instinct and commemorating them with our names. And so I guess I look at these caves and think about that they're an abstract history lesson told from a person that is exhumed by me, a person who is a half scientist, a half artist, an evolutionist, a native son, and someone who's like very affectionate about a people and a landscape. And that's it. Thank you.